Hello everyone, welcome to the new video for this week, and today we'll continue our discussions on DataGrid2. We'll be continuing from the same our first video that we did for DataGrid2s, where we spoke about how we can do different hacks with DataGrid2. So if you already have access to this project, then you can pull the latest updates from the project by just going to Studio Pro and hitting the changes and clicking the pull. So if you do the pull, it will fetch you the latest upgrades for this project, which I've already committed to this project and what we'll be discussing today. And if you don't have access to this project, then fill the form below to get access to this project. So yeah, and I'll add you to the Mendix project, so to the team, because we already have almost more than 20 people who are on the team right now. So that's amazing. So thank you guys for your support, and yeah, let's continue into today's video. So to discuss few things, or just a recap from our previous video, what we've done is we can add cities and then go inside them and generate weather data, and it'll generate some random temperatures and description messages for the last 100 days. So I went ahead and created new weather data for starting today. So now the new hacks would be, so for example, say if you want to get a detailed view of this weather, right, of one of the dates or any any objects that's in your data grid too, and if you want to, so you want to have an on click, but you also want that to open a new tab and not take over this page. So how do you do it, right? So we'll be discussing that. For example, say I want to see a detailed report about the 13th of October. So if I click on it, it should open the weather in new tab. And let's see, if I click here, it opens in a new tab. My this view doesn't change, so that's good, so that I don't have to go back and forth. And when I come here, it says, oh, so you click weather for city of Edmonton and for 13th of October. Now you say you want to compare two different days. So again, you go here and say you want to compare with the 15th. So you click on this one, it again opens in a new tab, and you can now compare these two tabs, saying 13th, 15th, right? So that's what it is. If you go here, you can do the same for Calgary. So say you want to go and compare 13th for Edmonton and Calgary. So go here and 13th for Calgary, 13th for, or sorry, 13th for Edmonton and 13th for Calgary. Now you notice that now we're using page URLs with static data, right? So that city and then some identifier that I have as a unique name uh, for the date, right? So for the weather object basically. So I for you can do this as anything, but what I have done is I've done city and then the date without dashes over here. So if I want to see the 15th, I can just go and do 15th for Calgary, and you see the date changes over here. If I want to do 15th of September, then I do 09. And I have, as long as you have the dates in your database, you should not see any problem with this. So that's what I have done. I could change this to Edmonton if I want. So and it changes to Edmonton, right? So that's what it does. That's the first thing that we are going to show, how to open a URL in a new tab, or how to get weather details in a new tab, right? And that's pretty simple. It looks complicated, but it's a very simple solution. And the second thing we're going to look at is if you change the order, or if you did any changes to your data grid, right? How to keep that saved so that next time when you come in, it the user sees the same things, right? So say for example, you change the date to be in ascending order, right? And you went ahead and hit the description as well. So now you have only temperature and date, right? So you go home, go to Calgary, you see everything. But when you go back to Edmonton, you see only these two because that's what you had selected, and sorting order in ascending. But say if I were to close this browser session and if I were to start again, right, I see I already have this data because it's persistent data. But if you go here, it switches back to the to the default config that we had set. So these are the two things that we'll be discussing in today's video. So let's go ahead and get started with the Studio Pro. So the first thing that we're going to look at is how to open URLs in a new tab is um, and how to show the right pages, right? If it was a single page, then it's fine. You just put a JavaScript and do it. But when you have dynamic pages with or pages with dynamic data on them, you need to show different things. So the first way to do it is, or the first step that we do it over here is first we create a page that's a the weather details that we want here, right? We didn't focus on fetching all the details per page, all the details for the weather page for that particular day, because that's not the main objective of this video. So we kept that section empty. But the first thing we start with is we send in parameters that we want to show the weather for. So city and weather. So weather module has the date for for which we want to show, right? For what we want, or for the day on which we want to show the weather details. So we pass those two parameters. um, so city has name and zip code, and weather has date, description, temperature, um, change from the previous day, and date as where we store it as string. So that's what we'll be using as a as a unique value, right, to display the page URL. So, and how do we build a page URL? So if we go to page properties from here, or just open up page properties, right? So what we see is there's a section for URL. So you can go, I went here, and so if you're opening any pages in Mendix, it will have a slash p assigned to it. You cannot change that, but you can add things after that, right? So we went ahead and added a city name and then weather date string. So the date str or date string is the attribute, which is what I've kept as a unique attribute on my end, and you guys can set it up however you want. But what I've done is to keep it simple. I've just added as date str. You could do an auto number as well, which could act as your ID, right? So custom ID. So you could be doing that as well. Now, once this is done, what we go ahead and do is uh, is how to open this page. So if you just say, okay, if you go here and in the data again do on click as show a page, right? Then what it'll do is it'll open the page on the same, um, or it'll open the new page on the same page. So you lose your view, so it won't open in a new tab basically, right? So we need to do a nano flow for that. So I built a nano flow which is simple, um, which first gets the application root URL, right? So in this case, application root URL for me is localhost 8080, right? So if I go to settings, my application root URL is 8080. But you cannot hard code this. The reason is, say if you deploy this, this project to a dev environment, test environment, UAT environment, pre-production, production, right? So um, you cannot, if you hard code it over here, say, oh, I want it as localhost 8080, then that same thing will go into those applications as well. So you need to use the root URL as a variable and not something that's hard coded. So how do I get a root URL? Now to get a root URL, it's easy. You just have to have you just need to call a microflow that calls this particular Java action, which gives you the root URL. So the root URL Java action is a part of the NanoFlow commons. So when you pull changes for this project, you will see that a new module was added over here that's called community commons, right? So you'll get the application root URL from community commons, and then you can just wrap it in a microflow so that it can be called from a nanoflow. Otherwise, a nanoflow cannot call a Java action directly. So that's how you do it. Now, once you get the application root URL, you build your URL, right? So application root URL slash p slash name of the city, and then the weather string. So that's how I have set my page URL over here to be. So uh, over here to be say city and weather string, right? And the p over here is mandatory for page for Mendix, so you cannot change that attribute. Now, so that's how it is. And then I have another nano flow which calls a JavaScript action to open this particular URL in a new tab. So the reason I've done it as a nano flow so that I can reuse it anywhere I want. You could remove the nano flow and put the JavaScript action over here directly. There won't be any problem. But this is how I like to do it. So that's how I have done it. um, yeah, and then I have a JavaScript action which takes URL as a parameter so that it knows what URL to open. Now when you go to the JavaScript action, what it does is takes the URL as a string of string type as a parameter and then passes on to the code. When you go to the code, it's simple, right? Just one line: window.open URL blank. That's it. So when someone so basically what this nanoflow does is when someone clicks on one of the page parameters, it gets the application root URL and then builds the URL based on the structure we had decided for the weather details page, and then opens it in a new tab. That's it, right? And we are able to do this directly because with Mendix 10.0 we can build page parameters however we want, right? So it gives us a lot of flexibility to open to set the page URLs. So that's good. So say, then you come here, um, and let's put a breakpoint and see how everything looks. Okay, so when you click on one of the dates, what it does is it stops here and then step over. So you see we got the application root URL which is localhost 8080, and then step over, and it builds a URL for us that is slash p slash 2014. And let's copy this as well, and you hit continue. It should open the page in a new tab, but there's some issue with the way Mendix builds nanoflows. So if you put a breakpoint over here, it will not open the page URL in a new tab, but if you remove the breakpoint, it'll do everything on its own. So now this becomes so easy because now that we have the page URLs, you can distribute these page URLs to anyone, right? However you want, they can go ahead and build this. So say you gave it to someone, so basically you can share this page URL with anyone. If you have a mobile view open, then you can share this via WhatsApp or iMessage or a text message or SMS or anything you want, right? Send it as an email or multiple options to share. But it becomes easy because now this becomes a static URL, but it also acts as a dynamic URL because the page data can change anytime as long as the URL remains same. So and if the end user is smart enough, they can go and do this for different days as well, right? um, so that's the first thing. Now let's go to the second thing where our default config changes, right? uh, so say we went to home, um, change this to sorting order, went back to home page, Calgary, everything is the same here, but let's go back to Edmonton, and it sticks, right, for now. But when you close this and reopen it, then go back to Edmonton, then it's a default sort config here. So there are two things that we did in the previous project for sort configs. So if you haven't seen the first video, the link is in the description, and you should be able to click up in the right corner of your video to take a look at that particular first part of this DataGrid2 tutorial as well. But let's go ahead and close these windows first and jump over here again. So how do we get the sort config? So the sort config is stored in the personalization section, and it is, and we have an on change microflow that does that does sorting or updates the table based on our rules, right? So that's it. But we're storing the sort config and the config in the sort config attribute for our data grid helper. So that's our data grid helper, and that's our data grid helper, right? um, where we store the sort config. But if we go back over here, how do we get the sort? How do we get the data grid helper? Because that's what is important for us. So say we send in the city name, we search the um, we search the association for city if there's any data grid 2 helper, right? And if there is, it will give us a list of those, and we take the head from it. And then what we do is we get the data grid to help if we check if it exists or not. If it does, then we reuse the same thing and change the sort config to the default sort config. And if it doesn't exist, then we create a new one. Also, if you look at the domain model, right, we have the data grid 2 helper as a non-persistent entity, which means this particular object lives in the browser and not on the not on Mendix database because it's non-persistent. So what happens is, as soon as you close the browser, the connection between city and data grid 2 helper is lost. So if you close your browser or if your session has ended, then what happens is you lose this connection. So every time this one, if and then if you call the data grid 2 helper, it will not find anything from here, right? And it'll create a new one. So the first way to avoid this is by creating this data grid 2 helper as a as a persistent entity, right? So let's store it as a persistent entity. So that's the first change you can do to to get everything, or to for it to stick, right? So that your data grid 2 or your sort config remains the same for multiple sessions. So say you change the config to something else. Say we are showing four columns, but you went and updated to hide one of the columns and to show only three columns, because that's what I like it, even though my product has five different rows, but I want to see only two different rows. Then yeah, I should be able to, once I've customized it, it should remain the same. So that's one, right? So let's come back over here. Is the project, okay, it's still running. Okay, so let's go to Edmonton, right? And date, and then hide the description. Okay, so we have date and temperature. We go back home. Calgary is the same, we haven't changed anything. uh, Edmonton, if you go back, it has changed now. Why has it changed, right? So the reason it has changed is because we're using something called um, sorry, not we're using, but when we set up the when we see that, oh, a data grid 2 helper exists, what we do is we change the sort config to set it to be the default sort config. So once we remove this, it will start the config will start sticking, because now we're not manipulating the config every time we save it, or every time we change it, right? Or when we fetch the new data grid 2 helper. So basically, when the session starts, we're not manipulating the data grid 2 helper now, even if it exists. What we're doing is we're just setting it to default, or setting it um, to whatever it was in the past, right? So let's come here. um, we have two different cities, right? And it is persistent. So let's say Edmonton, and save it as this, sorted by date ascending. And let's close the browser over here. Okay, so it should be saved. Now if it doesn't, then we'll have to investigate what the issue is, but it should be. If you go to Edmonton, you see date is in ascending order, right? Even after the change of a session. And again, because we have an association for city to weather, so each city will have its own data grid 2 helper. So if you go to Calgary, it will have its own sort config. If you go to Edmonton, it will have its own sort config, right? So say Calgary, you updated, or you sorted by description. Go back home. Edmonton is sorted by date, right? So let's close this, start a new session, and go back to home page. If you see Edmonton, it's still sorted by date. If you go to Calgary, it's still sorted by description, right? So, and this can be done for anything. So say you changed your you did your changes to say high temperature over here, right? So you're showing only date and description for Calgary, but if you go to Edmonton, you want to show only date and temperature. So that's how you do it. Okay, so every time you go there, your view or the data grid view should stick, right? Should not change. So close this, restart the session. Now you'll see Edmonton has only two dates, and Calgary has only two columns, sorry, not dates, but two columns here, which is date and description. And Edmonton has only two columns, that is date and temperature. So that's how you do it. I'll be going ahead and saving these changes as well to the DataGrid2 helper, where I did small updates where for domain model I made the DataGrid2 helper as a persistent entity, and the DataGrid2 helper where I removed the sort config or default sort config, right? So on using an existing one. So these are the two changes which I'll be committing after this video, and you should be able to see it. Now we could also go ahead and turn the data grid 2 helper and city association into one-to-one association. That should not have any problems. So you guys go ahead and do that and let me know if you run into any problems doing that. um, I will be doing it in the future, but I want you guys to go ahead and try and see if you run into any issues, right? So if you run into any issues, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and or if you haven't added me on LinkedIn yet, you won't be able to send me a message, but you can always send me an email if you want to neil@goldenearth.ca. I'll add my email in the description as well. So that should make things easy for you, right? Thank you so much for watching this one and have a good day, guys.